In June 2001, Dipendra was crowned King of Nepal while laying in his hospital bed. He was in a completely comatose state after having shot himself in the head following the Nepalese royal massacre, during which at a party he killed his own father, King Birendra, his mother, and a few other princes and princesses. He died shortly after being crowned, and the reason behind the attacks are still quite a hotly debated issue. The most widely told theory says that he wanted to marry a woman that his family disagreed with. Others have theories that somehow the Indian Secret Service or the CIA was involved, or maybe a former king wanted to claim back his throne. Plus, out in the countryside of Nepal, communists had launched a civil war just a few years beforehand, so it was a chaotic situation, and still no one really knows why it happened. So most people believe that Dipendra massacred his family because he wanted to marry DEVYANI RANA. She came from the powerful RANA dynasty, which had a long history with the royals, and who I will talk about in a bit. But there's even conflicting reasons as to why the family would object. Like, some say that she would bring influence into Nepal, which they disagreed with, or some people have suggested it was because she was of a different caste. And this theory that he wanted to marry this woman seems pretty believable. As Jonathan Gregson says, the prince was apparently very drunk that evening, so drunk that he had to be brought back to his bedroom. But once inside of his bedroom he phoned Rana, and then came back to the party, dressed in military clothes and carrying a submachine gun and a rifle, killing most of the royals in just a couple of minutes. Having weapons, by the way, was not rare for royals in Nepal. Apparently he even brought guns to Eton when he studied in England. With most of the royal line of succession wiped out in a single day, the crown passed on to GYANENDRA. He was the younger brother of the king, and had been king before, albeit very briefly, as a child in the 1950s. Nepal at the time was going through turmoil and a revolution against the king, his father, and as he was out of Kathmandu at the time, this has led some to believe that he was involved somehow in the massacre. Others have suggested that Dipendra was angry with his father for accepting constitutional rule, as it was very much an absolute monarchy beforehand. Or maybe he was angry with his father for how he was dealing with the Maoist rebels out in the countryside. Or maybe, as Gregson said after he interviewed him in 1999, "I could see the protocol under which they all lived their lives. Quite frankly, it would have driven me mad if I'd lived there." The prince was, after all, 29 and had to hide the fact that he smoked from his parents, couldn't marry who he wanted, and after studying in England and enjoying life there, he had to return to the strict royal life of Nepal. So maybe he just went a little bit mad with all of the rules. Plus, to add further fuel to the conspiratorial fires, only a 1-week-long investigation was held, and allegedly, the bullets were found in the left-hand side of his head, when he was right-handed. But to fully understand all that was going on in all of these intrigues, we have to go right the way back in time, and explain the monarchy's role in the country. So, Nepal was divided up into numerous states before PRITHVI Narayan Shah united the country in the middle of the 18th century. He had been the ruler of the small Gurkha kingdom, but with the help of his general, KRISHNA KUNWAR, he was able to assert his dominance over the mountainous nation. The Shah dynasty would then rule over Nepal during a time in which they fought wars against Tibet and the British, ultimately losing to both, and problems within the court were commonplace from the beginning. For instance, King Rana Bahadur Shah abdicated from the throne in 1799 to make sure that the son of his favourite wife would inherit it. Yet when his favourite wife died, he had a mental breakdown, brutally punished court physicians, had statues of gods destroyed, and tried to claim back the throne. But he had lost all support and was forced into exile alongside his ally, BHIMSEN THAPA. Meanwhile, in Nepal, his wives and various noble families fought for power, with some being assassinated. The exiled king then returned to Kathmandu, but was executed by his half-brother. So the dead king's ally, BHIMSEN THAPA, looked to remove any potential enemies, and at a meeting in his house, revealed the names of everyone who was allegedly working with the British. This resulted in the Bandar Kal massacre of 1806, which lasted for a couple of weeks, and nearly 100 of his political enemies were killed inside the royal palaces. So this royal massacre of 2001 was not the first massacre to take place within the royal residence. Later on, Rajendra Bikram Shah became king, but he was a weak and ineffective ruler, allowing noble families like the Tapas to run the country. But over time, more and more power was given over to his wife, and other families began to vie for power. That is until 1846, when a confidant and lover of the Queen was found dead in his prayer room, shot in the back of the head. Who killed him? No one knows to this day, so we could add that to a list of mysterious deaths in the Nepalese royal palaces. The Queen responded by ordering that all the major families meet within the palace to find the guilty. She suspected it was a member of the Pandey family and ordered that he be executed. Fighting broke out, but one nobleman had brought with him a number of well-armed troops. This was Jung Bahadur, a descendant of Ram Krishna Kunwar. The king and queen had already left, but Jung Bahadur, within the palace once again, was able to exploit this chaos, and he killed a number of nobles. He then formed the Rana dynasty, which essentially ruled the country while the king was reduced to a puppet ruler. And this wasn't even the only massacre in the royal palaces that decade. Shortly afterwards, the queen conspired to have him killed, but Jung Bahadur caught wind of this, ambushed the conspirators, and yet another massacre occurred. So there is a clear history of massacres within royal palaces. So the Rana dynasty were the real rulers of Nepal. Think of them a bit like the shogun in Japan, while the king was more like the Japanese emperor. That is until 1951. Now around this time, many exiled Nepalese had been taking part in the Indian independence struggle and began to push for change in Nepal. They formed parties like Praja Parishad and the Nepali Congress, and even created a military wing for them. During this time of turmoil, the king TRIBHUVAN fled from his palace to India, and this is when the young GYANENDRA was crowned king. But most importantly, the Rana dynasty had to step aside, and a non-Rana prime minister was brought to power after this, the 1951 revolution. So for a little while, the country was a constitutional monarchy, but it only lasted for around 9 years. After BP KOIRALA was elected in 1959, the new king led a royal coup. This was King Mahendra, who had the prime minister and members of parliament arrested, and he established the panchayat system, which was described by them as a partyless democracy. However, really, the king just had full power. King Birendra then succeeded his father in 1972, and after huge protests held a referendum to see whether to carry on the panchayat system. But strangely enough, the system won the referendum of 1980. But now we're into the modern age, and Nepal still had a king with ultimate authority. Meanwhile, across the borders, obviously China was a powerful communist state, and in India, communists were gaining in popularity. For instance, in 1967, communists in Naxalbari rose up against the Indian government, and the communists continue to have their largest support in the elections in this region, sometimes called the Red Corridor. So, as you'd expect, communism within Nepal started to grow as well. The new group, the United Left Front, joined forces with the Nepali Congress and began to agitate for reforms. Protested blockaded sections of the capital in 1990 and surrounded the government buildings despite the police killing many of them. This forced the king to remove the ban on political parties, but decades of absolute monarchy and lack of reforms had left the people struggling. Poverty was still high, many still lived under the traditional caste system, and illiteracy was roughly about 40 to 50% and a lot higher in the countryside. But the Nepali Congress was able to win the first election. However, promised land reforms did not come quickly, and strikes forced the government to force lights out during certain times to preserve power. Many saw the new government as failing to live up to their promises, and in 1997, the communists started the Nepalese Civil War. They obviously sought to remove the king from power through a people's war, largely out in the countryside. And this is when, at the royal palace, the king held a party for his family and was killed. As I said before, the official investigation only lasted a week or so. Some elements seem to contradict themselves. The Maoists were in fact the ones who claimed that the CIA or Indian Secret Service was involved. Or there's also the fact that GYANENDRA was in Pokhara, which some see as suspicious. As, after all, every single person who was in line to the throne before him was wiped out, and he was able to take the throne. Now, as the new king, he suspended the constitution to deal with the Maoist insurgency, but this angered many and he was forced to restore parliament and to make peace with the Maoists. However, in order to make peace, the monarchy was suspended in 2008. This was initially seen as a temporary measure by some, and while in exile, he occasionally talks about returning. Now, many will protest if he plans to turn up in Nepal again, but it should be said that some polls put around 50% of people saying that they would like to bring the monarchy back. So the problems with the Nepalese monarchy still persist today. Now, here's my question to you. First of all, what do you think the reason behind the massacre was? Do Do you think it was just because he wanted to marry this woman, or do you think there was something more to it? I completely do not know. And also, do you know of any other unexplained world events that have strange conspiracy theories behind them? Often it feels that just American conspiracies gain any traction, so I'd like to hear some more. For instance, one more I'll throw out is in 1994, the presidents of Burundi and Rwanda were travelling in a plane, but was shot out of the sky. However, who did it remains a mystery. So leave yours in the comments below.